Good morning, church.
Good morning.
I thought we'd start with a little joke this morning. I know, be prepared. A clergyman was walking down the street, not me, when he came upon a group of about a dozen boys, all of them between 10 and 12 years of age. The group surrounded a dog. Concerned lest the boys were hurting the dog, the clergyman went over and asked, "What are you doing with that dog?" One of the boys replied, "This dog is just an old neighborhood stray. We all want him, but only one of us can take him home. So we've decided that whichever one of us can tell the biggest lie will get to keep the dog." Of course, the Reverend was taken a bit aback. "You boys shouldn't be having a contest telling lies," he exclaimed. Then he launched into a 10-minute sermon against lying, beginning, "Don't you boys know it's a sin to lie?" And ending with, "Why, when I was your age, I never told a lie." There was dead silence for about a minute. And just as the Reverend was beginning to think to himself he must have gotten through to them, the smallest boy gave a deep sigh and said, "Oh, all right, you get to keep the dog." Last week we started talking about our loneliness. And while the scriptures last week testified to the fact that we are never truly as alone as we think we are, it is in those moments of loneliness that we should listen for the still, small voice of God. Like Elijah, the same voice that calls to us when we are living in the caves of despair speaks to us of the close presence of God and points out to all the people who are not nearly as far as we thought they were. Among them are those God has called us to teach us and to learn from us. I don't know about you, but before we ever arrive at that experience of loneliness, I would rather avoid it. Amen? It's not that we don't need a little alone time once in a while, but we are hardwired to be social to a greater or lesser extent. As God said of Adam in the Garden of Eden, it's not good that the human should be alone. And the famous American psychologist Abraham Maslow listed love/belonging as the third tier of needs on his pyramid, just above having our physiological and safety needs met. Then love and belonging. Or as Queen put it, "Can anybody find me
somebody to love?"
You guys are good. And we might add to Queen's lyrics, "that will love me back." Our souls are designed to be engaged in complex networks of relationships. Some of those networks challenge us, and some affirm us, but all of them are designed in some way to enrich us. On a global scale, where would we be without both the voices of prophetic challenge and the voices of loving reassurance that after all, it's all going to be all right? We need to form connections with God and with people. Jesus himself pointed to this when he told us in his great summation of the Hebrew Scriptures to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So if we are made for these relationships, sisters and brothers, why do we find it so difficult to maintain healthy ones? We often read Paul's letter to the Galatians and get stuck on the list of selfish actions. It's kind of like watching a train wreck. It's hard to pull your eyes away from the train wreck to this comprehensive list, in this case, of destructive behaviors that Paul regards as obvious, a lot like a train wreck. It might be interesting to watch an hour of news, or maybe most of the shows on the CW network, on TV, and see how many of these actions we can spot. Just tally them up as you go through an hour of television. Fighting, check. Group rivalry, double check. Moral corruption, check. Jealousy, yep. Selfishness, oh yeah. Partying, definitely. Hatred, sadly true. But the problem is that this list sounds like Paul sounds like he's giving us a new set of commandments, or the epic version of the thou shalt nots of his own generation. But Paul's point isn't to tell us what not to do in telling us this. I mean, let's really be honest with ourselves. Other than perhaps casting spells, how many of us can say that we completely avoided any of this list? Church say, well. Like the preacher trying to tell us that he's never lied before, we may end up condemning ourselves in trying to rewrite history. Church say, Lord, help us.
Lord, help us.
We've come to adopt many of these behaviors as normal. But to a former first century Jew who had reaped what he'd sown from these actions, Paul knew that his readers could see all around them this very same list of sins being played out in the world. And he wagered they could see where it was all headed. Now, Paul's list of sins falls within a larger discourse on the nature of our freedom. By his willingness to go to the cross, Jesus showed us something new, that sacrifice could set the world free. Jesus experienced the drive to do all the things on Paul's list, but he cut himself free of their strings and sacrificed his ambition for the sake of the least, the last, and the lost. Sisters and brothers, that's us. And because of his willingness to lay aside himself, Paul and the others who followed Jesus in the lifestyle that they called the way were astounded to discover the abundant life that Jesus had planned for them apart from their own selfishness. The yoke of thou shalt nots was gone, replaced instead with a core value of loving God and loving your neighbor. I suppose that it's a little like learning how to drive, for those of you taking driver's ed this summer. I suppose that it's a little like learning how to drive, right? When you first get started, you're so busy learning the rules of the road that it's hard to enjoy the ride. True?
True.
Our eyes are kind of fixed on the pavement in front of us, making sure you keep it on the road, especially if you're really nervous about that driving thing in the beginning. Right? Yeah? So you remember this? I know for some of you it was a while since you learned how to drive.
We hit a mailbox.
But you kind of have to pay attention straight down. Like, don't cross the line, right? Especially that shoulder line. Don't cross into oncoming traffic. Was that a solid line or a dashed line? Can I cross that one? I forget. When we get a little bit more confident, maybe, we might find it easier to keep track of the road signs and the behavior of the other drivers or even the pedestrians on the side of the road. Before long, we do most of these things almost automatically. And then we can focus finally on the ride itself. It's not that we're ignoring the more basic rules, but their interpretation has become a natural instinct for us as a driver. This is the kind of freedom that Paul is trying to describe. When our relationship with Jesus is active and alive, we know it. And we can tell more easily when something is good and just. The problem, Paul says, is that our newly found freedom allows us to sometimes start transgressing the rules of the road because we're so confident that we feel they no longer apply. I can turn across the double line. Who does that hurt? The other driver should just know that I'm changing lanes. I don't need a blinker on. What stop sign? It was a four-way stop. The problem is, when we engage in this kind of behavior, what we are doing is using our freedom in Christ as an excuse to hurt each other. Paul is less worried about the lives of individual believers going astray and more worried about the impact of this behavior on the entire community of believers that he's writing to. If you bite and devour each other, he writes, be careful that you don't get eaten up by each other. The problem with doing whatever happens to feel good is that we end up hurting others in the process. And if everybody starts to seek their own welfare instead of the welfare of the group, then we wind up perhaps even eating each other. Philosopher Thomas Hobbes, writing in the 17th century, described our natural condition of humanity as a state of nature, in which we are all fighting survival of the fittest style for whatever happens to appeal to us or we happen to feel we need. Paul wants us to remember the people on your left and to your right the next time we desire to indulge ourselves. One way seeks to your own wants, while the other way leads to the benefit of everyone. If we live by the Spirit, he writes, let's follow the Spirit. Let's not become arrogant, make each other angry, or be jealous of each other, he concludes. Instead of using our Christ-found freedom to say and do whatever we want to one another, let's use it to build each other up. In this way, we will follow the Spirit into a cultivating of the Spirit's fruits: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness or generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Paul writes in other places that there is no law against such things because they represent a higher law that we live into. And truly, we can start ignoring, in some sense, the old list, the list of the way we used to behave. and begin to see the fruits of God's Spirit in us. Truly, if we embody these things, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, what kind of people will we be? Remarkable people, God-breathed people, people who are able not only to live with themselves, but people who are able to live fully in community. Imagine if all of us had the depth of soul to be able to reach out to each other and build one another up this way. God smiles on those people. Church, sometimes we think that our journey has come to an end. Elijah, in this morning's story, seemed to be headed in that direction. Everybody told him along the path that he and his mentee, Elisha, were on, that this was going to be an end. Elijah, they whispered, do you realize that your mentor, Elijah, is going off to die? And Elisha said, be quiet. Shh, I don't want to hear it. But he continued on with his mentor. Elijah took that mantle of his and he struck it down on the river Jordan. And the water parted, and they were able to walk across to the other side. Much in the same fashion that Moses had done to the Red Sea, and certainly as Joshua had done as they came across the same Jordan River to enter into the Promised Land. There Elijah was taken up in a whirlwind. And we would think that Elisha would have said all those other prophets were right. This was an ending. But he had told Elijah, I will stay here, and if you can give me anything, give me a double portion of your spirit. So he picked up the mantle that was left lying on the ground of his mentor Elijah, and he picked it up and put it on himself. And he went back to the Jordan River. And just when we think the story must be over, he's taken a souvenir of someone that he loved. He takes off the mantle and he strikes the river. And the river parts in two, the same way he had seen his mentor do not so long ago. The story goes on. And when we feel like we are bound up in Paul's list or simply the end of a road, God gives us a new ending. The story goes on, church. How will our story unfold? Not just our personal stories. How will our story together be written? We entrust our story today to the hand of God, to the one who loves us and who cultivates in us all the fruits of God's own Spirit. In Jesus' name. Amen.